Hi, my name is McComas. I'm the Senior Program Manager at Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities Initiative and the co-author with Matthew Kahn of the new book, Unlocking the Potential of Post-Industrial Cities. In this new webcast series, we explore themes discussed in our book by diving deep into the history and future of the 6 post-industrial cities of Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. We look at the ways in which these cities can improve outcomes for people, neighborhoods, and businesses, and how they can attract new residents and investments so that everyone can reach their full potential. Today, I'm honored to be joined by my co-author, Matthew Kahn, Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Economics and Business and Director of the 21st Century Cities Initiative at Johns Hopkins, and Arpit Gupta to discuss our new book and access to capital for small businesses and startups. Arpit Gupta is an assistant professor of finance, the Leonard N School of Business at NYU. Professor Gupta's research focuses on household finance, real estate, and corporate finance. Hi, Arpit. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So today we're going to talk about venture capital investing in post-industrial cities and social impact investing. So generally speaking, so we get a sort of broad understanding of it. How do venture capital investors evaluate the physical location of a business they're investing in? So, how might an investor view 2 identical businesses, but one is located in St. Louis and the other is located in San Jose? How might they sort of evaluate that investment differently?
So I think there are 2 reasons that venture capitalists have historically preferred the business located in San Jose relative to the business in St. Louis. And the first is monitoring. So a venture capitalist will most commonly place someone in their company on the board of that company. And to facilitate the monitoring of that business, having that located right nearby in the Bay Area makes it a lot easier to travel and visit and do those governance functions. Obviously, that's changed a lot with COVID, as many of these board meetings and other attributes of corporate governance are being done remotely. And the second key reason is that the Bay Area just has this unique agglomeration of talent. So remember, what venture capitalists are really trying to do is try to find that next big company which will scale really rapidly, because their business model really requires them to find 10 different companies, each of which have some probability of growing really rapidly. And to find that company, they're willing to tolerate that 8 out of the companies that they invest in will actually go completely bust. They're really looking for that option value of growth, which may present itself. And the reason the Bay Area historically has been unique in that is it just has the density of programmers, of talent, of software engineers that can enable companies to do that growing function. And so it's out of consideration for monitoring the company and also for ensuring that it has sufficient growth capacity that historically VCs have been looking more towards companies located in these critical tech hubs, cities like San Francisco.
So building on that point and sort of thinking about cities that aren't San Francisco, Boston, or New York City, getting investors to focus in on one city in particular can be a challenge. And some of my research, I've seen this in Baltimore. And what some local foundations and charitable organizations decided to do was to create a VC fund in the city called Propel Baltimore that provided investments of up to $250K in startups that were either located in Baltimore or were willing to relocate in the city. And the first one was really successful. So they opened up a second fund and they included corporations and private investors and went to sort of larger ranges. But generally speaking, I think these type of place-based or city-focused funds can be viewed as too risky to investors that want to spread that risk over, not only multiple companies, but multiple cities. So is this type of investing more limited to sort of triple bottom line foundations and sort of private mission driven investors? Or is there an actual real market here that's not being fully realized?
Right. So I think you point out one risk of investing with a place-based strategy in mind, which is you're exposed to the risk of that particular city. And so if anything goes wrong, that affects all of your investments. Ideally, you are balanced with respect to the investments you make as a venture capitalist so that some of the success of some of these will balance out the failures of others. In addition to that geographic kind of idiosyncratic risk, I think the other issue that investing in Baltimore specifically presents is trying to have that sufficient base of talent that is going to be there to grow these companies, right? So as a VC company, you want to be able to invest in, a range of companies that all have that scaling growth potential available to them. Now, the fact that they're located in Baltimore makes that governance part easier that we just mentioned, because you can have a VC fund, closely monitor all these companies, but you want to make sure that all of these also have the capacity to grow as needed. And in doing so, you really look for there being a sufficient local talent base, right? And you look for universities that are able to supply those engineers, those software engineers, and so on and so forth to supply and grow those businesses. So I think finding the sufficient pool of entrepreneurs and talent would be really necessary to get a place-based VC fund off the ground. And with Baltimore specifically, you might wonder whether you have that density of local talent, right? There may be other cities in the country that are perhaps better placed, maybe in Miami, maybe Pittsburgh, that actually have more density of local entrepreneurs, or there may be ways that Baltimore can better leverage the skill sets that it currently has to attract more of these individuals to develop that sufficient tech base.
So looking into that issue further, how important is local knowledge for VC investors? So, if a Baltimore investor is making an investment in a Baltimore company, what advantage do they have over a Boston investor investing in a Baltimore company?
So VC investment does historically tend to be local for the reasons we kind of mentioned. So there is just a better knowledge, understanding of the local entrepreneur scene. There are often close links between universities and local VC companies. So a very common route, for example, is for a professor at a university to leave and start a company, or for them to have a pipeline of talented students that go out to local industries. So these kinds of connections mean that there tends to be this historic link between where VCs are and the companies that they invest. That being said, there have been some changes in this environment, particularly in the last year. So you see many more VC companies being more comfortable investing in firms that are actually quite distant from where they themselves are located. And you see other VC firms pick up and relocate themselves entirely. What that suggests is that there may be greater willingness for firms to invest at a longer distance than before, because either you think that the governance aspects are capable of being done remotely, or you think that the scaling possibilities in a more remote world might be different. So you think that you can invest in a company and they'll be able to attract talent over the internet and grow their business by hiring fully remotely, rather than being limited to the talent base of the city in which they happen to be located.
So again, thinking about geographic diversity, Steve Case, had his moment with the Rise of the Rest seed fund when he was going on bus tours around the U.S., visiting 5 cities in 5 days, and again looking outside of New York, San Francisco, and Boston, and trying to make seed investments in some cities that are traditionally overlooked but have some good research universities. Was this just sort of a feel-good novelty moment, or are investors actually actively trying to find investments outside of those traditional markets, because there is some sort of, if you find a diamond where nobody's looking, there's something to gain there. And if that's the case, what can cities like Baltimore and St. Louis and Cleveland do to sort of highlight the possibility of the rising stars?
So I think that particular tour was a little gimmicky. Another thing I would say has historically been a little gimmicky is the interest of cities in trying to grow their own tech clusters. So this historically has been a very popular strategy that cities have been trying to do. And unfortunately, most cities have not been able to engineer tech hubs or clusters themselves, right? This turns out to be something that is very difficult to do from the top down. At the same time, there have been some changes which mean that I would say it's not necessarily that VC companies are like looking for alpha in undiscovered geographies, so much as previously they would have maybe even discarded an idea or an entrepreneur just purely based on the location, because of their sense that this person's not really serious or not moving to SF. And now it seems like VC firms are more open to entrepreneurs that happen to be located in different parts of the country, to the extent that they're able to really demonstrate that they have a superior product, a superior business model, and the capacity to, again, do that scaling function and grow. So what this means for cities like Baltimore is that it will be very hard for them to truly replicate everything that San Francisco can currently offer. But you have to look very closely at what particular tech specializations, tech hubs, what particular industry concentration you have as a city, which may attract a cluster in that particular subsegment of the market. So for a city like Baltimore, that may have to do with certain manufacturing processes that still happen to be there. It may have to do with the link with Johns Hopkins and the biomedical complex. You just have to look closely at what particular industry mix and composition you have locally that may serve as the basis for a emerging cluster centered around that particular industry. It's a very common misconception that entrepreneurs are people that are young, that are, the image of the entrepreneur is someone like Mark Zuckerberg, right, who drops out of Harvard and starts this fancy new company. A much more typical example of an entrepreneur is actually the CEO of Zoom. So he happened to work for Cisco, and he had an idea he wanted to do, and the company didn't want to do it. And so he left Cisco, started his own company in San Jose, right? So it's the prototypical work from home company, but it's headquartered in San Jose. And one of the big reasons is that, well, that's just where he was formerly working at Cisco. And so he left that company at, he was 40 or so at the time. And so it's actually older people that have been working at established firms for an already a substantial amount of time that then find themselves frustrated with their current companies, leave and start a company. So you want to look at what existing companies do you already have? What clusters are you already attracting? And can you do more to further expand those clusters, encourage existing workers to branch out on their own, or encourage existing firms to expand their scope of operations so as to develop that already existing cluster? It's quite difficult to grow this kind of thing inorganically.
And so is that then another challenge that cities like Baltimore don't have, these big companies like Cisco that have, this hundreds, maybe thousands of employees who are experienced and are sort of at that stage in their career where they can spin off? Is that sort of a necessary condition to really generate enough activity there?
It's certainly an important condition, but you have to look broadly at what set of firms you are already attracting, right? So you've got the Johns Hopkins complex, obviously, so you have already a large established base of researchers who are doing very innovative work, who might potentially be interested in starting companies themselves. You have an existing industry mix. You have the historic port district, and you have another important advantage, which is the low cost of living, right? And so that presents many people with an attractive opportunity to live, work in a city that's not going to drain their paycheck the same way that living in New York, living in San Francisco is going to do. So there are some important advantages that many of these cities have, which can serve as the basis for revival, but it revolves around trying to figure out what your existing strengths are and complementing those, rather than trying to borrow completely inorganic, completely new things that the local city may not actually have the strength in.
Matt, can I jump in there? This discussion fascinates me. Arpit, I've never been a good macroeconomist. With low interest rates right now, are venture capitalists able to tap into even more money than usual? Is there any links? How do they raise their money, and are they borrowing now because interest rates are so low?
So the short answer is sort of not really. And it's an interesting phenomenon because the VC industry as a whole is sort of remarkably small in size, right? And that reflects the fact that the size of the investments that they're making in all these different firms are themselves relatively small. These are startups. So VC has an outsized impact on the economy relative to the funds that they're actually putting in. What that means from the fundraising standpoint is that many funds are oversubscribed. So they were already had more investor commitments than they were able to fully deploy. So the key constraint in putting more money to work in VC is somehow not really the fundraising environment. It's not really low interest rates. This just happens to be a very high risk, high involvement, high capacity style of investing in which everything is kind of more insulated from the day-to-day business cycle.
So turning from sort of thinking about places to thinking about entrepreneurs that investors can make investments in, Edward Duggar became famous for leading UMC Ventures in the 80s and 90s and investing in Black founders and sort of only investing in Black founders. And that really made him an early pioneer in sort of the impact investing world. And he was able to achieve a really impressive IRR, initial rate of return of 32%. He proved that he could sort of both do, make a top return while making a socially impactful investment. So, a couple questions here. First, why aren't more people doing this? Is it sort of a path dependence and a lack of, community knowledge and sort of insular thinking? Looking at sort of venture capitalists, as you just highlighted, it's a select amount of people. More than 80% of them are white. A lot of them are from Stanford and Harvard, I think around 40%. So, if that's an issue, how do you begin to address it?
It's a really challenging problem because of how specialized this particular investment class is, right? So the ranks of many venture capitalists are filled through a variety of ways. One common way is for people to be successful at a tech company themselves before moving on to become venture capitalists. And so that necessarily narrows the rank of people you're looking at to the handful of people that have had great success in the tech industry, for example. You have these very tight social links between elite universities and these venture capital funds. And then finally, there's another factor, which is that there is sort of a leaderboard among venture capitalists themselves. So it is both desirable for the VC to find high-grade investments, and at the same time, firms that are just starting out also have a preference over VCs. It's considered quite prestigious to get funding from a top-ranked VC, right? That presents a very attractive signal down the road. And so because of that, you have this path dependency and prestige of existing firms that also happen to have an existing partner base that is disproportionately white and disproportionately male. And that does have consequences on investing. Aside from the example you mentioned, another study has looked at whether VCs that have daughters make different investments from VCs that don't have daughters. And it turns out that they do. So when VCs are kind of considering the possible, they're imagining the future value of investing, right? You're trying to make a judgment on whether this investment will turn out, and you don't necessarily have hard data to make that assessment completely. You have to rely on a certain degree of discretion. And so people make that discretion on the basis of their lived experience, which will differ for different groups. So I think you're right that the nature of the VC industry has limited its scope in certain ways. It is a very challenging problem to ultimately address because it revolves around the dynamics of a very particular segment of the investing world. That being said, I think VCs are at least cognizant of this. And so there are a variety of initiatives to try to increase diversity in the industry.
So when you're thinking about people that could sort of disrupt this and looking at, people that have the capital to come into the game, how realistic is it to think of people like movie stars and musicians and sports stars, to sort of think of somebody like Magic Johnson coming in and being a big investor? Is that possible, or is there too much gatekeeping? Is there a special skill set that they really, it would take them too long to learn, or would they be able to enter the world, say, I've got money and I want to shift investing where I can towards more Black entrepreneurs?
So I think you have seen the entry of some of these celebrities that have had an impact when it comes to industries that they themselves understand very well. So in the music industry, entertainment industry, there are a lot of startups that are in that universe. And so some celebrities may actually have specialized knowledge about their particular industries. But more broadly, VC investing is such a difficult and specialized job that there seem to be these very strong differences in returns that different investors are able to realize. These tend to be persistent on some level. And so that suggests that there is an important component of scale that a wealthy outsider is going to have a difficult job fully matching.
So thinking again about investors, matching investors and entrepreneurs, there seems to be sort of increased interest in social impact investing in 2021. But these investments are still a tiny portion of VC funds. Is there more work to do on matching of potential investors to entrepreneurs and saying, looking at people who say that they want to invest in Black startups and Black businesses, but they might not know where to put their money towards? Is there something more that could be done to direct and sort of inform these potential investors?
So I think the two things that would really make a big difference here are certification and mandates. So certification would consist of trying to find ways of labeling and getting credit for investments that are being done on a social impact basis, right? So when a VC fund currently makes an investment into a Black-owned business or a female-owned business or a minority-owned business, they don't necessarily get the quote credit for that, in the sense that investors are not necessarily aware that that type of an investment is even taking place. So in the green space, there has been a lot of work on trying to certify funds, firms, so on and so forth, that are green and not green. And there's a whole separate debate about whether that's actually effective. But the fact that you have certification is one thing that allows the investors to then market products to people that they're looking for funds from and say, hey, we've got an impact fund here, we have another green fund here. And those ultimate investors themselves may have mandates on their own end, right? So we see this, for example, in the New York State pension funds that have increasing mandates to invest in these kinds of minority female-owned businesses, for example. So as more of those types of ultimate investors, these pension funds, foundations, and other kinds of investment vehicles are seeing changes in mandates on where they're expected to deploy capital, I think there will be some synergies between those motives, as well as the certification processes for the venture capitalists and other investors to put that capital to work, that will help everyone realize that, okay, this dollar of investment is actually going towards this ownership status by this particular group. All that being said, I think while that's a vehicle to deploy capital to those categories of minority, female, et cetera, owned businesses, I think in parallel with the green investing world, where all this is just a little bit more advanced and there is a little bit more interest in certification and mandates on the part of investors, there are, I think, concerns about how effective this is at deploying capital towards actual green uses, how much of a real effect, in other words, it has. But certainly there is already enormous interest in this kind of concept from investors, and I think we're just waiting for better market design tools in order to deploy more of this capital to work. The broader trend is, I think, certainly for investors to be considering non-monetary aspects of their investment. So considering aspects of their investment beyond just the dollars that are returned, thinking about the broader consequences of their investing philosophy.
So beyond sort of investors having knowledge of what they're putting their money towards is toward the social good. Is there something that could be done by the federal government, or say the Biden administration could do to help direct funds, either through some sort of incentivizing private citizens and businesses to invest in these types of businesses?
So one small example that kind of comes to mind on the labor side is one idea that's in the recent immigration bill of having immigrant heartland visas. So that would create, targeted immigration basically to certain regions. And it doesn't necessarily have to tie immigrants to that particular location forever, because we know that immigrants also move in clusters. So if you have a certain migration of a certain group of immigrants to a particular city, it's likely that some of them will stick around. And so that's an example of a place-based strategy that's oriented around labor, which is intended to try to revitalize certain communities by attracting that particular labor source there. I think what you're pointing at is a possibility, well, maybe we could do something for capital. maybe we could try to find ways of redirecting capital to certain places, which will have exactly these kind of multiplier and long run effects you're talking about. Obviously, a recent example of this is opportunity zones, which was pursued by the Trump administration. And I think the jury is still out on whether that was an effective way at ultimately growing investment. That would be one example of a local place-based, geography-based strategy to try to incentivize and encourage investment in local areas. That, you know, all that being said, I think the number one thing that the federal government should do, aside from certain targeted subsidies, et cetera, but the number one thing I would encourage the federal government to do is really tackle zoning and housing regulation, because I think that's the number one deterrent towards any of these strategies really working out for cities, is the fact that even if you're Baltimore and you're supposed you're successful at actually growing this tech cluster, this tech hub, a huge problem is that will lead to higher rents in the area, right? And that will actually adversely affect the local residents. And so this possibility of basically gentrification, I think, has historically been a huge concern with respect to all these kinds of investments, right? The concern is if you just grow the local businesses, they're just going to gentrify the population, raise the rents, and so the local residents will not see those benefits. The way to avoid that bad political dynamic is to build more and to allow for increases in business investment to actually translate to increases in housing supply, which will enable all residents to share in the gains from these investing strategies. And that's an issue on which I believe the Biden administration is also considering some changes in the recent infrastructure bill. And that seems like the area where the federal government has the most lever to actually push. With respect to a lot of the other capital strategies, it's probably more difficult to think of the precise levers that the federal government actually has with respect to different localities, right? A lot of those tools and mechanisms are actually in the hands of state governments themselves. And so, you know, the federal government may not be the best actor in order to encourage certain kinds of investments, but it has access to other tools which can change how housing regulation works in the whole country.
I'm going to support you to be the next mayor of New York City. I like what I'm hearing.
So now thinking about starting to turn toward more traditional, slower growth types of businesses, and thinking about you know, new alternative lending models. I think we've seen a big rise in crowdfunding over the past decade or so. And while there's been some research that has shown it's eliminated some geographic issues around the distance between investors and entrepreneurs, it still heavily relies on the existing social network of the entrepreneur in driving the ultimate crowdfunding and whether they meet that goal. So it does still, to a certain extent, depend on physical proximity. So thinking about tools like crowdfunding, what are some potential opportunities and drawbacks of that sort of model?
So one example, this is a little bit more broad in the overall category of alternate credit scoring models, but I think one example of an interesting model is what Square is pursuing. So Square, the financial provider, is in a unique position because they have kiosks at local cafes and stores and so on and so forth that accurately track sales. And so they're able to measure very accurately the true sales potential, not only of my local cafe, but of all the local cafes in the area. And they've begun to provide loans on that basis. So they'll make a loan to a local cafe by observing their sales, local cafe sales, that allow them to determine, okay, we think we can make this investment at a certain rate, and they recoup the loan every time someone swipes a card on that Square machine, right? So they have a natural channel for repayment as well. So that is one example of an alternate financial lending model. So it's also through a fintech company that is using these alternate credit scores, because, you know, we kind of think back on the kind of full trajectory of different business models. The VC model works very well for that certain subset of businesses we talked about that have the scaling potential, that tolerate a high degree of failure. With respect to the broad mass of small businesses, however, you're looking at different lending solutions that typically rely on trying to recoup your money and really trying to minimize kind of the risk of failure, right? So having sufficient collateral, having sufficient ability to recoup your capital is really important. And I think we have been lacking in some ways in developing the tools to sustain business financing towards this broad mass view of small businesses. So something like the Square model of trying to find alternate ways of both understanding the business prospects and collateralizing your revenue in some sense by taking the stream of revenue provided by the machines themselves that they have. That's one interesting model. I think we need more innovation and understanding of these business models, especially because all of this is happening in the context of an increasingly nationalized banking system. So one thing we've seen in the last 10 years since the financial crisis is that the entire banking industry has been getting a little more concentrated in the top few banks. We've seen large declines in credit unions, local banks. Historically, these were the financial institutions that were really responsible for extending credit to local businesses. And that whole funding model has been replaced a little bit. To some extent, we've seen business development corporations replace this. So these are REIT-like publicly traded companies that are purchasing small mid-market loans. So they're packaging together loans that are made to these kinds of small businesses in a capital market vehicle. So that has, to some extent, taken the weight of lending that banks are no longer willing to do. But broadly, I think we have huge issues in lending to these categories of small businesses. So there's a real lack of financing opportunities, I think, here. So again, one way of trying to address that is to introduce more fintech companies and more fintech styles of lending that may be done on a national scale. And so cities may want to think about alternate ways of financing and models that will be particularly likely to produce benefits in their local area to those local businesses. This is a particularly important need, I think, coming out of COVID-19, because we've seen the failure of so many businesses, so many services, restaurants, yoga studios, so on and so forth, that we need to start up again. And so doing so requires a certain degree of capital. And I think ultimately we need to ensure that those capital opportunities are made available, not just to those entrepreneurs that have a great idea that will be the next Zoom, but also to the person that just wants to start a yoga studio or start a cafe in their neighborhood, because this also provides job opportunities for people that live in the area. And historically, cities have been these engines of opportunity because they offer this density of opportunity for all local residents. And it's important to ensure that small business is able to provide those opportunities and financing is available for those businesses.
So when you mentioned Square, one of the things I immediately thought of was part of what they're able to see is a better understanding of sort of current risk because they have a good view of essentially a real-time view of what companies are having flow, in terms of revenue. So in terms of thinking about like better ways that companies can or lenders can assess risk among entrepreneurs and sort of small businesses, that especially those that lack collateral or have low credit scores, how can the private sector more effectively evaluate risk and get collateral outside of traditional methods? I mean, I'm thinking about sort of like character-based lending models, which you've seen some community development financial institutions employ to underwrite returning citizen entrepreneurs. So, what sort of is there space for innovation in that world?
I think there certainly is innovation, room for innovation here. One example is developing countries, which are doing a lot of innovation in various ways. So, companies are doing everything from looking at your mobile phone and looking at various patterns for how you use your phone to predict your willingness to repay a loan. There are a lot of digital traces that you leave that can all be combined with advances in analytics to better predict your repayment on loans. So I think there's room to apply more of these techniques to small business. Another example of a place where there is a lot of innovation is China. So particularly with Alibaba, the broad conglomerate there, they're really doing a lot to try to leverage the fact that they have a platform that sellers are on there. They're selling, various products on this, giant Chinese platform. And so the company has a division and financial that is actually providing a lot of loans to these types of entrepreneurs because they have a much better understanding of the sales that this seller is providing, right? So the parallel would be if companies like Shopify or Amazon were able to better develop analytic tools based on their comprehensive understanding of sellers' sales volume and other financial information. Really, these kind of platform and tech companies that already have a high degree of information about different sellers and their risk, as you pointed out, would be in a nice position to extend more of that credit to those different businesses. And I think that is ultimately also a question of regulation, whether we want to allow Amazon to open a bank, under what regulation we're going to allow them to do so. But I think that can all be managed in a way that will benefit a lot of the small businesses that are already on a lot of these tech platforms.
Thank you. Matt, do you have any other questions?
No, I think this is fantastic. Arpit, at the NYU Stern School, are the MBAs, do they view investing in cities, and is that part of their agenda? Do urban economics issues arise in your finance classes?
So I teach real estate finance, and as a result, it absolutely does, right? So when you invest in a real estate asset, the first thing you learn is its location, location, location. So you're looking at not only an investment in a building, in a particular property, but also the context of the urban environment in which it's located, right? And so many of my students are definitely interested in working in the real estate industry in New York. And so they're very excited and interested by the opportunities presented by our particular urban local fabric. Other students are interested in thinking about other cities, other areas, other places to possibly move and invest in. When they're doing so, they're also very interested in the local urban environment of the area that they're planning to work in real estate. So my sense is that the entire real estate industry has been cognizant for many years of the fact that their investments are taking place in the context of an urban fabric. And so it's essential to understand what's going on with the city broadly, even if you're making an investment in a particular area.
Thanks.
This has been fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for having me.